Hello and welcome. Your hosts, Tim Santoni and Joe Buerlen, joining you on the podcast Background Screening Tips in Tech, helping you guys go further and faster with your background screening. We're trying to share some tips, technology, and we'll be interviewing some influencers on the show. Thanks so much for tuning in, whether you're listening or watching. Joe, welcome. Glad to have you this morning. How are things in Ohio?
Things are good, man. It's starting to turn into a little bit of fall weather, so that's my favorite time of year here. So looking forward to that.
Awesome. Yeah, that'll be great. So today we're going to talk about a subject that I think there's a lot of confusion around, and that is the difference between a fingerprint or a LiveScan background check and a traditional name-based background check, where we're indexing based off a name, date of birth, address, and social security number and other information on an individual. And I think that there's some massive amounts of misinformation, so hopefully we can clear those up. And feel free to leave us some questions in the comments. We're happy to get back to you if there's something we don't cover. So I think first off that we should cover the fact that a fingerprint or LiveScan background check is built on the premise that the information comes from fingerprint information that's entered into a system that's collected by law enforcement. It's really geared for local, state, and federal law enforcement to track and index records and information. It's not really meant for a background screening or a private employer to access. And so while there's, fingerprinting is fairly accurate, and my fingerprint's different than Joe's, and it's a pretty accurate way of doing that. The biggest issue that I think that we don't understand is that not all crimes are fingerprinted, and those fingerprints are not into the system, and those fingerprints are not necessarily uploaded to multi-jurisdictional database tools out there. So, Joe, maybe share just statistically, what some research and information you found as it relates to, the level of records and what kind of information could be missing.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? So something to remember, I think, for everybody is that there is no mandate out there that says, any state or jurisdiction within any state has to report its information up, right? And so with that, you get a lot of voluntarily reported information. So let me speak to Ohio, for instance. The state of Ohio's background check, the Ohio BCI, you'll see a lot of schools, a lot of places of education and things of that nature utilize that as a source of background records information. In 2015, the state of Ohio found that the BCI repository in which you were running your fingerprints through was missing upwards of 10,000 records. And those weren't, small little, DUIs or traffic violations. They were serious records that were missing from the Ohio BCI. Now, if you take it and you look at it from, a national repository, so like, for the FBI, for instance, the FBI does a lot of the same record repository as the states do. The problem is that the FBI fingerprint, even with the records in there, 50% of the records that they have in there don't have case information. They don't have a disposition to end the case. So the information that's getting reported back to you, you may not even be able to use it anyway for hiring purposes without a disposition.
Yeah, and to hit on that point too, FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, that would assume that the applicant or the person you're screening was arrested for and charged with a federal crime. Most federal crimes are pretty serious things. So majority of crimes are usually filed, arrests and criminal charges are filed at the state or county level. So again, those high level things that we want to see, we don't even have enough data from the FBI as to what ended up happening. So it's really, really unuseful information. I think the other part that we should talk about is the fact that just generally speaking, right, if there's inaccurate or misleading information within the system, it can't be reported. Additionally, the applicant can't really contest what's found in a LiveScan or what's found on a fingerprint background check, where a traditional employment background check can be. And we talk about criminal records as a backbone for most employer-level background screening systems, but a LiveScan does not incorporate civil records. It's not going to typically pick up on sex-related offenses. It's not going to have any verifications of employment or education. And most DMV-related status issues are not going to be found there. So it's just really high-level fingerprintable crimes. And what I was surprised in doing some research is that the frequency at which that database is updated is very, very slow. So it's not very current. And if there was a conviction in the last, say, 60 days, it's not up there. It's not going to be available. And I think we talked about it, Joe. The time and the cost associated with doing a LiveScan is something that We talk about background screenings being completed in 24 to 72 hours, and that's kind of the standard. Share a little bit about what a LiveScan looks like from a time and cost perspective.
Well, I mean, I want to kind of circle back to one of the things you said, because you brought up something interesting, right? And the ability for an applicant to contest the information found within LiveScan. And so you're right. So as a consumer reporting agency, or a CRA, background screening companies, as they're commonly referred to, we're required to provide an applicant under the FCRA with the ability to contest anything that's on the report. And there are a lot of background screening companies that do offer LiveScan or fingerprinting. And they will offer the applicant that ability to contest that information because they're governed by the FCRA. But just an interesting stat, because you brought up time. If an applicant wants to, contest information on the LiveScan, it can take up to 24 days for them to even get a correspondence back. That's a long time. Now, granted, under the disputes and under an applicant's right to dispute, a consumer reporting agency does have, a 30-day window, but 24 days just to hear back, right? So they're not even talking to an individual at that point. So, I mean, that in itself is a time constraint. But it's going to take days. And I don't know, and you can keep me honest here, Tim, I don't know the exact number of days it takes to get the report itself back, but it can take upwards of 7 days for the FBI to even start looking at that information that you've sent them. But I don't want to speak to the turnaround time because I don't know it exactly.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. I think that right now, especially with a lot of government agencies being shut down, there's been actually severe delays. But from what I can tell, that you're looking at upwards of 2 weeks to return the records, and sometimes upwards of $75 to actually complete the check. So 2 weeks, $75, a typical background check, a basic background check by a screening partner who's FCRA and EEOC guideline compliant, probably in the 24 to 72 hours from the time they have authorization, and probably in the $35 to $50 range maximum. And they're probably getting a lot more information than they would through that LiveScan. So it's just very misleading when it comes to, the actual depth of information. And also too, if you look at EEOC guidelines, arrest records, which typically come back on a LiveScan background or fingerprint background check, are not reportable in many situations. And arrest is an indicator of a potential criminal issue, but it's not a reportable offense in most jurisdictions and under most federal guidelines. So, why provide information that can't be useful or actually cause more risk and more potential compliance and potential legal issues when you're doing something that you think is more robust?
Yeah, and just quickly looking, I just kind of pulled it up, just kind of look at some stats. And so we all know in the background screening industry, running a name-based search is going to take, depending on your provider and the jurisdiction, and if whether or not there's possible records that they're kind of tracking down. You're looking at a name-based search taking anywhere from, on average, 3 to 5 days nationally, right? And that's kind of a standard within the industry. It looks like FBI fingerprinting, its turnaround time is in weeks. So, that's what you're looking at as far as getting accurate, semi-accurate results, right? Because 50% of them are missing disposition records.
Yeah. And that just, in today's day and age, I don't think that's even something that most employers can afford, especially as they're trying to bring people back quickly and get them in. And then if they come back with a record, what are they going to do with it after that point? They may have had to onboard somebody in that time, and they face an issue of now you have to terminate them based on information found in the background. It creates more policies and more paperwork and more issues for an HR director, HR compliance, and legal counsel introducing that. So,
yeah, and you brought up another great point, right? You brought up the information that's found on there, right? And whether arrest records and whether or not you can use it. So I think if you're using a CRA to get your fingerprinting, you're probably a little bit more protected than if you're just an individual entity that's using fingerprinting and saying, hey, we're running our background checks ourselves. For those individuals, right, you are possibly seeing arrest records. And what are you doing with that information? So working with a background screening company, you're, either whether it's a new company that you're partnering with or it's somebody you've been with for a while, provides you a little bit more in regards to protection from muddying the waters, so to speak. You're not going to be seeing information maybe you shouldn't be seeing and making decisions you shouldn't be making based on that information, right? And so having that partner in place kind of protects you from that.
Yeah, and Joe, that brings up a good point. So I think that the other big difference is that we talk about name-based background screening versus LiveScan or fingerprint background checks. The one part that you were leading into is that by working with this background screening provider that understands state and FCRA compliance, you're getting more than a background check. You're getting information to make a decision, and you're getting compliance. So they're adjudicating the records. They're providing information based on where the employer is doing business, where the applicant lives or works, and they're helping to insulate them from potential harm and then give them insight into what's been found. So if a LiveScan comes back with records found, you can't call the FBI or the state and say, hey, what kind of records are these? What kind of charges are these? Can you interpret what these mean? They're not going to answer that call.
Right. So let me ask you this question, because I think in terms of background screening, there are certain industries in which LiveScan or fingerprinting is typically the reason why they don't need a background screening provider. What do you think the biggest misconception is for fingerprinting versus background screening from an outside perspective?
I mean, I would say that the biggest misconception is that the fingerprint or LiveScan background is more robust, more complete, and more thorough than a traditional name-based. And the other part is I think that there's a tendency to lean towards doing the LiveScan or fingerprint background check because they hear of a compliance issue or industry they're in or some legal or insurance-related issue, and they think that that's the only option that they have to meet those compliance requirements. But yeah, just the thoroughness and depth, I think, to answer your question, is just that it's just so much more robust and complete than a traditional background.
Yeah, I'm always curious, right? Because I've always thought that maybe that the reasoning behind that is they hear FBI background check and, oh, well, if the FBI is using it and it's their background check, oh, it's got to be good, right? And I'm just wondering how much that plays into, a company's decision to say, hey, let's utilize this product to protect our brand, right? And not realizing that the whole point of that database, those databases, whether it's the, for instance, I'll speak to Ohio, the Ohio BCI, or it's the FBI fingerprinting, those were meant for law enforcement agencies to utilize. They weren't meant for employers to utilize. It just kind of became a secondary option for use of that. So.
Sure. An example of where this comes into play, let's just say that as California is an example, right? So let's just say you do a California-based LiveScan fingerprint background check, right? Comes back clean, right? But the applicant lived in, say, Southern California their whole life, but they drove out to the desert or maybe to the river or the lake out in Arizona, where they got involved in some driving-related DUI and maybe other, vehicular manslaughter or whatever else. The LiveScan in California is going to come back clean because the case was filed in Arizona, right? So they just looked at California. If you run a name-based search and you're running a DMV search, you're going to pick up the fact that they were in there for a given period of time, and there's going to indicate where to look. So while we think that a fingerprint is more robust, it doesn't substitute, because maybe the jurisdiction in Arizona is a very small jurisdiction that doesn't even have fingerprinting 5 years ago. They're not going to be able to fingerprint because they didn't have the technology, so it can't get into any kind of fingerprintable system. So that's where a traditional name-based background check is going to pick up and be more comprehensive, robust than the fingerprint situation. So that's just a basic case scenario. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on that, but that's one specific example where I've seen that come out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're spot on.
Awesome. So bottom line here is that we're trying to clear up some myths about name-based versus fingerprint, and working with a provider to help you, a screening provider to help you navigate those waters. You may have a hybrid situation where you're required to do a name-based or fingerprint, but you could supplement with a traditional background check, and you could mold those together. So we've had situations in the financial world where a LiveScan fingerprint is necessary, but they need to onboard the person quickly. They can't wait weeks, so they'll do a traditional name-based and supplement with the LiveScan as an example, or they do them together in conjunction and make sure that they're covering their bases. So there's always different ways to kind of go about and to deal with that kind of stuff. We're not saying that one's necessarily better than the other, but understanding the differences between what they provide and how they impact your business from a compliance perspective and how they impact you from a time and cost perspective are super important. So you make a better decision about what you're going to do when it comes to mitigating risk in your business, or if you're consulting with the business when it comes to background screening.
And Tim, you bring up a great point, and I think kind of the last thing that I want to touch on, and if I could get anything across to anybody in charge of background screening for their company or their entity, There are state mandates out there, right? So I know for the state of Ohio, daycare centers in schools in general, and even those working in the cannabis industry now, they're required to do a Ohio BCI fingerprinting. Okay, that is the minimum. But again, there's nothing stopping them from doing a more robust name search to protect whether it's the kids or their applicants or employees or the outside public. So just because you're required to do the fingerprinting doesn't mean you have to stop there. You can always add to that.
Yeah, and in my opinion, I think that you bring up a great point, Joe, in closing, is that you want to align your background screening practices with the risk tolerances, the compliance, the insurance, and the legal parameters for your business in the jurisdictions where you operate, so that you have the complete picture. Be comprehensive, be robust, go deeper, so that down the road, you don't come across something that impacts your ability to do business, or you have to go backwards and change and make a decision about an applicant that you otherwise would have never brought on in the first place. So customized screening, and I think it's very simple to create those packages that specifically meet those needs, and don't rely on one particular database. Look at an overall comprehensive package. Awesome. Well, thanks again for tuning in. Stay tuned for future episodes of the podcast. Whether you're listening or watching, we appreciate your viewing. And if you have any questions, we will link up our email and our LinkedIn profiles in the show notes below. Thanks so much for tuning in, Joe. Thanks for being with me.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone.